I don't remember the last time I was invited to a family gathering, but I remember all too well the last time I was thrown out of the house. I grew up in my father pointing to the door, my mother turning her face away, and my sister staring silently at the floor. 15 years have passed since that day. The world changed. I changed. But people's hearts didn't. My mother and Madeline, my younger sister, never called back, never mentioned my name. They erased every trace of me in that house from social media, and even from the stories they told others. I know this because a few old friends quietly sent me family photos without me in them. Captions where my name had never existed. And then, this morning, I received a wedding invitation. Not from my father, he's long gone, but from Madeline, the one who turned her back, the one getting married. The wedding invitation sat on the table. I didn't know how it found its way to me. Thick paper, my full name printed clearly, no note, no personal message, just the location date and 2 names. I never thought I'd see side by side. Madeline Grayson and Ethan Callahan. Ethan, the man I once saved in Kandahar, and Madeline, the sister who believed I caused our father's investigation, who blamed me for breaking our family. Someone who felt that way? Why would she send me a wedding invitation? Or was it my mother who sent it? Unlikely. That woman didn't even send a single word when Dad passed. I don't know the reason. Maybe deep down, I still wanted something good, hoped this was a signal for reconciliation. Or maybe it was just to show a message like, we're fine, happier even without you. I pulled out a chair and sat down. My name is Eleanor Grayson, Brigadier General in the United States Army. 34 years old, the youngest of my generation to earn that rank. My job doesn't leave much room for stillness. Most of it is thick reports, closed-door meetings with senior commanders, and life-or-death decisions made in minutes. But this morning, I had peace, exactly 15 minutes of it, just enough to make a cup of weak coffee. The kind young soldiers call military coffee. Bitter, but warm. Just enough to keep me from drifting into thoughts I'd rather forget. Until Dan Rivera walked into my office with an envelope in hand. He knocked 3 times before entering. He never waits for me to say, "Come in," not out of disrespect. After more than a decade working together, Dan knows when I need quiet, when I need pulling back, and when I need to face what I'm avoiding. Dan is my senior aide. He didn't say anything at first, just placed a file folder on my desk, then pulled a white envelope from his jacket pocket. He paused, like waiting for me to speak. I shifted my gaze from the coffee mug to the file touching the folded edge, a wedding invitation. I didn't need to read it to know who it was for. "I think you should see this," he said. I set the coffee down. "What is it?" I asked. I opened it. A wedding invitation. Heavy, cardstock embossed names, Madeline Grayson and Ethan Callahan. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen one before, but something still caught in my throat as I looked at it. A hint of bitterness and a pain I recognized too well. No message, no line like "we hope you can come." Just my name, a time, a place, next to 2 names I thought I'd never see together. I folded the invitation and set it down on the desk. My heart didn't race, but the ticking clock in my head seemed to stop. I turned to the window, morning light filtering through thick panes of glass as if trying to break through this concrete fortress. But it couldn't reach me. "I know," I said. My voice was flat mechanical. People might not believe it, but the truth was already there. Dan tapped the desk lightly twice. He took a slow breath. "Are you going to go?" I paused for a second, closed my eyes like listening to something inside me. The bitter coffee carried the taste of the past, of being erased from a family tree. I took another sip, letting the bitterness settle in my chest and recenter my balance. They sent it. "That means they want to know I'm still alive," I said. "Doesn't mean they want me to show up." "You got that invite from Ethan?" "Yeah, I did, Mom. I guess after all we went through, he still remembers you as a comrade." Funny how out of all the girls in the world he bumped into your sister, huh? Dan tried to smile like making a light joke, but stopped. Maybe because he knew this wasn't something I'd laugh at. So, are you going? He asked again. His tone wasn't quite concern, more like confirming logistics before making plans. I didn't answer right away, just thinking. Dan shrugged. I don't really want to go either, but if you're going, I'll make arrangements. We're guests after all. I gave a faint smile. Not wide, not long, just a twitch at the corner of my mouth. I'm not going to be welcomed. I'm going, so I won't be hidden anymore. I stood up, opened the cabinet and grabbed a folder. Book me a ticket. This weekend. Yeah. Make it an early one. I've got another stop to make first. Dan nodded. His posture straightened a bit. Understood, General. He stepped out. The door closed without a sound. I looked at the half-empty mug. The ice had melted, but the bitterness remained. I held the mug in my hand a few seconds longer. The ceramic was lukewarm, now the coffee inside no longer comforting, just something bitter and inert. I put it down and turned my chair slightly toward the window, where the morning light had grown stronger, but not warmer. The silence in the office settled around me like an old coat, and I let it. Because some memories only surface in quiet, and some truths only echo when everything else stops. 15 years ago, I stood in a different room, holding a very different kind of silence. I was 19, home from my second semester of college, and I had gone looking for a flashlight in the hallway closet. Instead, I found a folder marked St. Mary's Community Fund. At first, I thought it was some old church paperwork, nothing unusual. But inside were ledgers, receipts, and notes scribbled in my father's handwriting entries that didn't match the church's published records. At first, I didn't want to believe what I saw. I stared at the same numbers over and over, willing them to mean something else. But they didn't. They meant exactly what they looked like: theft. My father had been siphoning money, small amounts, sure, but consistently for years. I remember bringing it to my mother. It was raining that night. I didn't wait for dinner, didn't wait for him to come home. I sat her down at the kitchen table and spread out the papers. I remember her face, blank, then tight, then cold. She didn't deny it, didn't argue, just closed the folder slowly and said, "Your father does what he has to. This family has survived a lot, and we don't tear ourselves apart from the inside." I told her I couldn't unsee it, that I wasn't asking her to do anything, but I had to, that if no one else would speak up, I would. She didn't cry, she didn't plead. She just stood, turned her back to me and walked upstairs. I filed the report 3 days later. The investigation took a few weeks to get traction. When it did, the fallout was immediate. He wasn't arrested, he was too well connected, but he was removed from the church board. People talked. Whispers followed us at the grocery store, at Sunday service, even at the gas station. But the worst was at home. My mother stopped talking to me altogether. She cooked for 3, not 4. She left my name off the Christmas card list. Madeline stopped answering my texts, my calls. Once I found her in the hallway after school. She looked at me, eyes wide with something like fear or maybe hate, then turned and walked the other way. One night, my father came into my room. He didn't yell. He didn't hit me. He just pointed at the door, said, "If you're going to act like you don't belong in this family, then you don't get to live in this house." That was it. No speech, no second chances. I packed what I could in a duffel bag and left before sunrise. I didn't ask where I should go. I just went. The porch light was off when I shut the door behind me, as if it had never once been left on for me. I slept on a friend's couch for 2 weeks, picked up extra shifts on campus, and I didn't speak to anyone in my family again. Not when I graduated, not when I got deployed, not even when I made captain. It wasn't stubbornness, it was survival. I became someone else over the years. Not in name, not in history, but in posture, in how I walked into rooms, in how I stopped flinching every time someone mentioned family. I learned to write my own records without waiting for someone else to approve the version. But every now and then, on quiet mornings in the pause between back-to-back meetings in the half-second before an aircraft lifts off, I'd hear my father's voice again. Not shouting, just that cold instruction, if you don't belong, you don't stay. And every now and then, I'd ask myself whether belonging was something you fought for or something you eventually stopped needing. Because 15 years later, I was still drinking bitter coffee, still checking my phone for nothing, and still wondering why a wedding invite from someone who once erased me could make my heart squeeze in ways I didn't admit. Maybe that was the part that hurt the most. That even after all this time, some small, ridiculous part of me still wanted to be asked to stay. 5 years passed. I was 24 when I found out my father had died. Not through a phone call, not even a forwarded obituary. It was Facebook. Of all places, of all ways. I had logged in to check on a unit reunion page. Instead, I saw a memorial photo, my father's old church portrait, softened with a black ribbon in the corner, posted by a former parishioner. Rest in peace, Pastor Grayson. I stared at it for a full minute, trying to convince myself it was someone else, another man, another family. But no, the comments confirmed it. So sorry to hear, he was a good man, gone too soon. All past tense, no mention of surviving daughters, no tag to my mother or sister, no tag to me, of course. I had been written out of that story a long time ago. I didn't cry. I just sat back, closed the laptop, and stared at the wall of my quarters until the sun went down. That night, I booked a flight. I didn't know why, there was no invitation, no funeral notice, but something in me needed to see it, to confirm that it had happened, that it was over. When I landed the next day, I didn't text anyone. I didn't even have their numbers saved anymore. I put on my uniform but removed every tag. No name, no rank, just camouflage and boots. Invisible but present. The funeral had already happened by the time I arrived at the cemetery. The parking lot was nearly empty, but a few cars lingered. I stayed in mine for a moment, watching the trees sway in the summer wind. Then I stepped out and walked toward the hill where the new graves were laid. I saw them from a distance, my mother's stiff posture near the casket, Madeline beside her in a black dress, her eyes hidden behind sunglasses. Other people stood scattered, murmuring final condolences. I didn't recognize most of them. I stood behind a tree far enough to stay unnoticed, close enough to hear fragments. He was so proud of Madeline, someone said. She's the strong one, you know. He never really recovered after, well, you know, that mess years ago. Poor man, he did his best. I heard all of it. I heard the silence where my name used to be. It didn't surprise me, but it still left something hollow. When the mourners began drifting away, I moved closer. Not to join them, just to see. The coffin was already lowered. The ground was still raw, the earth unsettled. A simple plaque marked the grave. No flowers yet. I watched as my mother placed a small cross into the soil. She wiped her hands and walked away without glancing in my direction. Madeline lingered for a second longer. Then she turned her steps precise, her spine straight. Just like mine used to be when I marched for approval. Now she marched away from the grave of the man we used to call Father One, who chose silence over truth when it came to me. I stepped forward only after everyone had left. No fanfare, no camera to record it. Just me, the wind, and a grave I wasn't invited to. I didn't kneel. I didn't cry. I stood still, watching the dirt like it might give me answers it never did when he was alive. I remembered being 19, pointing a finger, calling out his theft. Remembered his face, angry, not ashamed. Remembered my mother's silence. Madeline's turned back. The slammed door. The footsteps I carried away barefoot on cold tile. And now here he was. Gone. without a word, without a moment to ask why. I didn't speak to the grave. I didn't need to. He had said enough in life by saying nothing. But I stayed, for a long time, until the sun dipped and the wind turned cool. On the flight back, I kept thinking about the dirt. How unsettled it looked, like it too didn't know how to hold the weight of everything buried there. No one reached out afterward. No message from my mother, no email from Madeline. It was as if I hadn't come at all. And maybe that was the point. To remind me that no matter how much I had earned, or how far I had gone in their eyes, I was still the daughter who should have stayed quiet. The plane landed. I stepped off. I saluted my commanding officer the next morning like nothing had happened. And for the most part, nothing had. Because silence had become our family's loudest tradition. That silence was still with me as I turned off the main road and followed the winding path up towards St. Augustine Cemetery. It hadn't changed much since I was a teenager, still tucked away behind the church, where my father used to preach, still hemmed in by tall oaks that swayed in the wind, like they knew the dead by name. The sun was soft that morning, filtered through grey clouds, casting shadows that moved slowly across the gravel. I parked beneath a crooked pine, shut off the engine, and sat there a moment, hands on the steering wheel. My uniform felt stiff and too formal for what I was about to do, but I didn't take it off. If anything, it gave me a sense of armour. On the passenger seat lay the bouquet I'd picked up hours earlier. 6 white lilies wrapped in nothing, held together by a single rubber band. Simple, clean, no theatrics. I stepped out, gravel crunching under my boots, and made my way past rows of markers. Some names I remembered: the old choir director, the woman who ran the bakery a boy I used to play with, who died in a car crash. But I wasn't here for them. I found his grave without trying. The headstone was modest, granite grey, with gold lettering that had faded with time: Robert L. Grayson, 1955-2010. Below that, a verse from the Psalms: he led with faith and compassion. I stood there, bouquet in hand, staring at that inscription for longer than I care to admit. Faith and compassion. Neither of which he had shown me the day he told me to leave. Neither of which were extended when I came home from reporting his embezzlement and found my things boxed on the porch. I knelt down and set the lilies against the base of the stone. The grass around it was just beginning to grow tall. No one had visited recently. "Hi, Dad," I said quietly, voice rough around the edges. I guess you've heard by now. I'm a general. I gave a small, humourless smile. Youngest one in my class. The breeze picked up, brushing the back of my neck. I thought it would feel like something. Like proof that I was right. That doing the right thing, turning you in, meant something. I looked up at the clouds, but it doesn't feel like anything. Not really. Not when I'm standing here talking to a stone. I paused. There was more I wanted to say, but the words were slow to come. "Madeline's getting married," I finally said. "To Ethan. Remember him?" "No, you wouldn't. You never met him. I saved his life in Kandahar. He doesn't know I'm her sister. At least I don't think he does. But she sent me an invite anyway. Or someone did." I looked back at the stone. "Do you regret it? Turning your back on me? Do you regret not calling, not writing, not saying goodbye?" My voice broke a little at the last word, but I held steady, because I think I spent the last 15 years trying not to care, trying to prove that I could become someone without your approval. And I did. But now I realize I trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Now I realize it doesn't undo the fact that I lost something too. I touched the headstone, fingers tracing the chipped edge. I'm not your daughter anymore, not the way you left me. That girl's gone, but you're still my father whether I want you to be or not. The lilies stirred in the breeze, petals shifting like they were listening. I let the silence stretch a little longer before standing. My knees cracked as I rose, and I brushed the dust from my uniform. "I hope you're proud," I said. "Or at least, I hope you'd understand." I didn't wait for some imagined sign, didn't expect the wind to answer back. I just turned and walked away. But halfway back to the car, I stopped, turned around, and said, not too loudly, but just enough for the wind to carry it, "Goodbye, Dad." In the car, I sat quietly for a moment, watching the cemetery disappear behind the trees in the rearview mirror. I didn't feel better. Closure was a myth we sold to grieving people to help them sleep. But I felt lighter. I pulled back onto the road and continued toward the wedding, toward whatever waited for me in that old house, in that room full of eyes and judgments and unspoken words. But at least now I wasn't carrying the weight of silence alone. I parked at the familiar driveway, brick-tiled, bordered by trimmed hedges and white pillars that had witnessed both laughter and tears from my childhood. Today, a bold ribbon stretched across the porch rail and a "Congratulations" banner fluttered. Wedding signs directed guests toward hope. My hand tightened on the wheel. My breath flattened. This was the same house, the same walkway, textured by memory now layered with expectation. Stepping out, I pulled on my jacket and felt the crisp air press against my cheeks. My boots echoed on the front steps, announcing my arrival. Past the doorway, the hall had been lit for celebration. Fresh flowers, polished floors, mirrored walls, reflecting smiling faces. Guests greeted each other, exchanging pleasantries, champagne in hand. But when they turned to me, the warmth vanished. Eyes flickered, curiosity, surprise, mild disapproval. Some widened, some narrowed, all unready for my presence. Madeline stood near the top of the stairs, in a pale lace dress, shoulders poised, yet eyes restless. When she saw me, her lips curved into a smile, not full, withheld by something dark. A spark of recognition, a momentary hesitation, then composure. She was in control. She didn't step down. She didn't cross space between us. She held her ground. Perhaps waiting. Perhaps calculating. James, dressed in his crisp suit, met me halfway. His voice softened, "Eleanor, His attempt to insert warmth stumbled mid-sentence when he noticed Madeline's tense posture. He gave me a nod, uncertain, respectful, then returned to his bride, placing a gentle hand on her back. A ripple moved through the gathering. A couple paused, mid-conversation. A woman dropped her glass. A child froze. The hall took a collective inhale. I hadn't spoken yet. I'd shifted the energy. Their eyes tracked me from my uniform to the new 3-star insignia to the resolute set of my jaw. I didn't seek confrontation. I didn't want apologies. I just carried the quiet assertion of my existence. That was my contribution to the ceremony. Madeline found me later, near the punch bowl, shoulders tight. She flinched as though expecting to be slapped. She leaned in, voice low. I didn't tell him. She avoided my gaze, thumb tracing the edge of a napkin. I couldn't. Regret dripped from each syllable. I said nothing, but I let her know I heard. I let her discomfort stand as testimony. The service continued, laughter resumed, glasses clinked, but I walked to a side table. There, a single place card bore my name unaccompanied by a chair. Just a token, Eleanor Grayson. No seat, but acknowledgement. A whisper. She is here. I watched James speak to guests, face aglow, as he spoke of the woman who saved my life in Kandahar. Madeline looked away. Green surface, but I knew better. Gratitude is not green. It's gold. I stepped outside onto the lawn, letting the evening breeze loosen the tension. The music drifted from the reception hall. Laughter came in waves. Their joy felt brittle, strained. I remembered the weight I carried in this house, once the weight of disgrace they piled on me. Now, my presence unsettled them. That was something. As twilight deepened, I returned to the house. I paused in the threshold, looked back. The scene, warm lights, gathered bodies, a story of unity. My reflection glimmered in the glass door. I reached out, brushing fingertips against the cold surface. I didn't say anything, though. I felt the urge to speak. I am here. I always have been. I walked back into the hall, nodding my head at a few distant aunts, who stiffened as if that gesture unsettled them. I passed by my mother. She caught my eye but didn't meet it. I caught a flicker of guilt or surprise before she turned away. She smoothed her dress. Her lip quivered. Madeline approached gently, dragging me toward the dance floor. She whispered, "We should dance." I hesitated. Do I pretend there's no past? Do I let her rewrite history? Instead, I stayed silent, allowed the moment to dissolve in the music, then stepped away. I left her hand hanging in midair. I found Dan in the corner nodding. He offered a water bottle. I shook my head. Some things aren't quenched by water. I made my way to the exit, weaving through guests. Their voices softened as I passed. Their smiles faded, but I could see the realization growing they had excluded me. But I had crossed back in. Outside, under dim street lamps, I lifted my phone and deleted the placecard photo. I didn't want proof. I wanted only reality. I wanted peace. I didn't stay to pose for photos. I didn't linger for a toast. I didn't wait for permission. I left. My presence had spoken louder than any apology. It meant facing what I had avoided. I drove back to the house where I'd grown up. My uniform was immaculate, crisp creases, polished insignia, 3 stars gleaming on my shoulders. As I got out of the car, I saw windows in the house where neighbours peeked, whispering between them. Their eyes followed me. I walked past them without hesitation. I wanted them to see the rank I'd earned, not question my right to stand here. The path from the curb to the front door felt longer than I remembered each step, echoing memories I'd tried to bury. Birthday candles, family dinners, arguments, tears. Every inch of that porch had witnessed me being labelled traitor 15 years ago. Now I walked back in uniform, unafraid. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. It sounded louder than I expected. Inside, footsteps approached. The door swung open. Mum stood there in a muted dress that felt like a trademark of mourning, too soft, too pale. Her expression was icy measured. She looked at me with lips pressed thin. "Don't cause trouble," she said, her voice cold and clipped. "Today is Madeline's day." The welcome I'd hoped for didn't come, but also I didn't need it. I stepped inside. No request, no permission. The hallway smelled of fresh-cut lilies and growing tension. I heard conversations pause, forks clink onto plates. I could almost feel the room collectively holding its breath. I stood a moment, letting their eyes scan me. My boots made a faint noise against the polished wood floor my presence announced without fanfare. No apology came. No spark of remorse. Nothing but the whisper of this house acknowledging me again. Mum closed the door behind me with a slow, definitive click. I turned and advanced into the living room, where chairs had been rearranged into neat rows. Soft cushions replaced the old ones, showing scratches from my teenage years. A place for me, no. They had not reserved one. Their denial was clear. I moved deeper into the room, passing tables, with hors d'oeuvres, mini quiches, finger sandwiches untouched. A champagne fountain hissed bubbly ignorance. No one invited me. No servers offered a drink. None remembered that I was a guest. The silence and the avoidance from guests' heads, turned eyes averted, was louder than any welcome speech I could have given. I headed toward the kitchen pass-through. There, a cousin poked her head out, saw me, and quickly ducked away. My presence had unsettled them. Good. A friend from high school stiffened, then found an excuse to leave. Fellow graduates of a shared childhood, now strangers in polite form. Their indifference was a statement designed to rend me, "You don't belong here." And yet, I belonged. This was my home once. So I stood and waited. A server offered a glass of water. I took it, sipped, slowly, savouring the emptiness. Mum appeared at the archway of the dining room. Her gaze met mine, but her lips didn't move. I nodded once, a formal acknowledgement I didn't intend to stay long. She ignored me. I walked past the dining table, lined with pristine place settings. There was no seat reserved for me, no sign of regret at my absence, just floral arrangements and champagne flutes glinting under the chandelier. They gave space for everyone else, but erased me by omission. For a moment, the old pain surged, the door slammed behind me 15 years ago, the anger in Dad's voice, the silent acquiescence of my mother Madeline's tearless betrayal. I shut it down. I swallowed the hurt. I stood near a sideboard next to a photo of Madeline and Ethan from some engagement shoot. I forced a smile and carried a small plate. Cheese, crackers, nothing indulgent, no attention-seeking. I didn't come for pleasantries. An aunt glided past. She looked at my uniform, glanced at me. I glanced back. She looked away immediately. I felt her look say, "What are you doing here?" So I stayed. I lingered. I disrupted the narrative they'd created and erased Sister no one needed anymore. Mum moved again. This time she stepped into the room, but did not approach me. I stayed at the edge of view. I didn't speak. I didn't ask for anything. My presence was enough. The shuffle of feet, the hush as photographers adjusted cameras, the low hum of unsettled conversation, that was me being acknowledged. I drank the water. I turned to leave the pass-through. On the way out I paused, my reflection in the buffet cabinet. The woman in uniform, tall, composed eyes steady. That woman was me, not the girl who ran crying 17 years ago, not the daughter worth erasing, but the general who refused to vanish. Parenthood, betrayal, redemption, they filled rooms. I walked away from that kitchen window toward the front door. My boots crossed the threshold again. Nobody followed or stopped me. I stepped onto the porch and waited until the click sounded again behind me. Then I walked back across the yard to my car, the golden afternoon sun casting long shadows. No cheers, no applause. Just the quiet certainty that I had returned, and even in the absence of welcome, I mattered. I slid into the seat at the far side of the guest row tablecloth, crisp silverware gleaming as though mocking me. There was no name card, no place set for me. I was the unfinished line in a family portrait. The chatter paused as I passed like a wave holding its breath. A few heads turned, eyes flickering, some meeting mine, most quickly dropping. I sat upright, shoulders back, my uniform still pressed ribbons bright. Their eyes landed on the empty chair across from me, looked away again. Madeline stepped to the podium, mic in hand. Her dress gleamed under the warm reception lights. She smiled, a practiced, pitiful smile. "So our wedding has a special guest tonight," she began. Her tone was mocking in the way only family drama can be. I guess you could call it military style. Because yes, my sister, she did something in the army probably. A ripple of forced laughter echoed across the room. I saw my mother suppress a grin before looking away, eyes fixed on Madeline's back. My chest tightened. The joke was cheap, but in that laughter, I felt every pair of eyes recoil as though I were a stain on their fine china. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't speak. I just listened, each syllable a blade in my ribs. I gripped the edge of the table so my knuckles glowed white through my gloves. From where I sat, I watched the flash of cell phone cameras, a couple of polite claps from guests unsure or too ashamed to applaud their own disdain. Formatting shame into small gestures. I remained statuesque, a silent statement cutting through the murmur. My throat was dry. I let the silence hold on. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, then returned to forced applause. They clapped out of habit or obligation, but none of it reached me. Madeline smiled again, bigger this time, triumph seeping through the seams. My mother's lips parted in a smile she knew wasn't kind or proud. It was a relief, the sort the guilty offer when they think they've won. I wanted to say something. 1,000 clever comebacks flared behind my teeth. But none of them would change the narrative she'd drafted. Soldier, sister becomes outsider. Conspicuous presence becomes comic relief. Instead, I held my gaze on Madeline for a long moment. No fury, no shame, just clarity. I saw behind her performance the brittle fear of being overshadowed, the relief that someone else would take the spotlight, even if it was fueled by cruelty. I slowly raised my glass of water in a toast, quiet, measured without a word. My eyes found Madeline's again. She froze. The room held its breath, a ripple of tension sliding across the polished floor. No one heard me. Maybe no one was listening. But I heard myself clink the glass, soft but audible. A single note of defiance. She didn't lead, so I didn't follow. I didn't turn away, didn't drop my gaze, didn't let the laughter win. Instead, I sat back and watched. I drank the water in 3 slow sips. My throat burned with cold truth. I held that moment, my presence unsilenced. Madeline dropped her smile. The mic volume cut in with her next words, and I heard only half something about love, family, gratitude. But I was done listening to what was said. I was rewinding to what was shown. Every eye turned, every aborted gesture, every forced laugh. When she finally returned to her seat, the room leaned back into conversation. The moment passed, but I stayed seated. I had no intention of fading into the background. I swallowed again and turned my chair just enough to face the head table. I met my mother's eyes. She looked away. Her denial struck me harder than Madeline's joke, but I didn't stand. I didn't speak. Not yet. This wasn't my moment to argue. This was my moment to observe, to own, to be. I sat there until the next toast began, Ethan's turn, and I watched the course of the night shift. Guests started clapping again, but the energy had changed. I wasn't the punchline, they were watching me. When the toast concluded, I lowered my glass and sat forward. The rest of the evening would be written in cautious conversation and brief, pointed silences. But I'd found the tone. I'd set the marker. My presence had become a declaration. I'm here. Not to disrupt, but to exist solid, immovable, heard. The room seemed to pause an instant. Threads of conversations unravelled, cut short by the silent weight of my decision. Then I saw him rise. James stood straightening, as though he carried the weight of what was about to unfold. He left his seat weaving through tables where guests shifted uneasily. I held my breath, the hum of the reception faltering around him. He stopped in front of me, respectful, unwavering. He didn't hesitate. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but firm. Then, louder, so the whole room could hear, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Brigadier General Eleanor Grayson, the woman who saved my life in Kandahar." Silence exploded across the hall. Plates creaked. Drinks paused mid-air. A murmur rose, uncertain, like a flicker of electricity in a dead wire. Some people bent their heads, avoiding my gaze. Others stared stunned by revelation and by the betrayal of a mission from anyone in that room. James waited a heartbeat, eyes on me, then turned back to the crowd. The weight of his words settled. He took a step away, returning to his bride without ceremony, almost as if he delivered a verdict rather than a compliment. All eyes were glued to me. I sat, still gloved hands resting on my lap body, rigid, yet composed. The hush hung heavy. For the first time, there was no laughter, no applause, just the gravity of truth echoing between walls adorned with lights and promise. A bead of sweat traced my spine, not fear, but relief. Every ounce of preparation, every step toward this night had led to this fracture in the illusion. I had forced a crack in the facade, even if it meant cracking what remained of my relationship with family. I leaned back, the chair creaking. Time stretched. Someone whispered in my direction, likely my mother. I saw her shoulders tense. Then I saw Madeline's face frozen mid-smile, plastic warmth cracking into something raw. I studied them briefly before turning my gaze forward, affording no reactions, but acknowledging the currents of emotion crossing the room. Confusion, disbelief, guarded respect. Someone finally cleared their throat. A distant cousin perhaps offering a stiff toast to General Grayson. Thank you for being here. The words came awkward, hollow a forced tribute. I inclined my head once, acknowledging, but not smiling. Dan appeared beside me, then placing a silent glass of water on the table. His presence was a quiet anchor. I nodded once at him, a gesture of gratitude, and sat upright. Only then did the murmurs begin hushed conversations like rustling leaves. She's a general. They never told us. He saved her life. Why didn't they tell us sooner? The questions floated through the room, unanswered in part by my choosing. The band caught the shift. Music paused. A server flinched glass in hand. There was a palpable tension. The reception had stopped being a planned spectacle and was now transformed into a reckoning. I thought of the dark years of the silence from home, of the invitations withheld and the door slammed shut. I thought of the photo collection erased, of the stories rewritten. And yet, here I was, standing tall under the weight of truth with allies among these strangers. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. Dan's silent signal that everything beyond this room had been secured. He'd confirmed flight's final arrangements, but that moment felt secondary to what transpired now. Then, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I brought the glass to my lips slowly, deliberately setting the taste of cold water against my tongue. It grounded me. I was present, a woman reborn under the glare of exposure. I caught sight of Ethan as he passed by, nodding respectfully. His eyes held a gentle warmth, an apology for holding back. He did what he could in that moment, lifting me from invisibility with a title spoken, a truth revealed. My mother shifted in her chair. I caught her eyes, a quiver of regret or indignation, I couldn't tell. She looked away. Madeline followed suit, her expression a tangle of discomfort, and something else, fierce shame, I didn't allow myself to guess. Then, the moment ended. Music resumed soft and tentative. A toast was made in the name of celebration. Conversation restarted in measured tones. But, in the midst of it all, a space had opened, a crack in their narrative where I stood indelible. I sat. I watched. I remained silent. Their laughter was cautious, their smiles uneasy. They may have been celebrating love, but they knew something else had happened, a reckoning layered beneath the vows and ribbons. When the moment drew to its inevitable close, James returned to Madeline's side. He offered her the glass I'd placed. She accepted it, pale and small. He squeezed her hand and nodded back toward me, an unspoken acknowledgement that would not be undone. I took one more sip, pushed back my chair, and closed my eyes for a second. My presence was confirmed. My story was no longer hidden behind family portraits or hushed disclaimers. It was in bold print in an unexpected place, a wedding hall where truth could not be ignored. When they called for the bride and groom's first dance, my name was spoken again, this time by Ethan, quiet but firm. Their footsteps drifted across the floor. Lights dimmed, murmurs quieted, and I felt the shift. I belonged in that room, now not by birthright, but by right of truth. A low melody filled the space. I kept watching until they were lost in their dance, then stood. It was time to leave soon. But before I did, I met Dan's eye across the table. He offered a small nod. I returned it. It was enough. I rose, smoothing the pressed uniform. My heart was steady, though my hand still trembled slightly. I walked through the gathering, nodding once or twice at those who dared to meet my eyes. Some smiled with uneasy acknowledgement. Others looked away, but none stopped me. Towards the exit, I paused, allowing a final glance at the dance floor, where their worlds overlapped. Then I stepped out into the night. I had entered this room as an echo. I left as a presence, unresolved, undeniable. And the night behind me carried the hum of changed hearts and broken silences. The hallway outside the reception was quieter than expected. Most guests stayed behind, unwilling to follow the ripples James had set in motion. I felt them watching, their eyes behind half-open doors, behind glass, behind politeness. That's when I saw her. My mother. She stood near the back pantry, backlit by a hallway lamp, arms crossed tight across her chest like she was bracing for weather. "Come," she said, not asking. I followed. She closed the door behind us with more control than force. The room was small, a storage space repurposed for quiet conversations. There were coats, folded chairs, and the lingering scent of mothballs. She turned to me, still composed, but the lines on her face twitched just once before settling. "You didn't need to do that," she said. Her voice was level, but thin, like she was holding it together with dental floss. "You made it difficult. For Madeline. For everyone." I leaned against the shelving. I didn't say a word. "You didn't have to," she snapped. "Your presence, your uniform. You knew what that would do." She didn't raise her voice, but each syllable struck like metal, tapping on bone. "It's Madeline's wedding, Eleanor. It was supposed to be her day." I stayed quiet for a moment then. And what was I supposed to be? A shadow in the photos, or just a ghost you forgot to mention? She shook her head slowly. "You always make it about you." I looked at her, the woman who taught me to set the table, to tie my shoes, to pray before bed. The same woman who couldn't bring herself to call when my father died. I didn't come to ruin anything. I came because I was invited. If that bothers you, you should have told her not to send the card. "She didn't," she said. Her voice dropped just enough for it to matter. "Ethan did." I blinked. "Of course he did." The room tilted slightly, just a fraction, like the floor had learned something and shifted beneath us. He had no idea what he was stepping into. She exhaled something between a scoff and a sigh. He thought he was being kind. He didn't know it would turn into this. "This," I echoed. "You mean being reminded that I exist?" "You didn't need to make a scene." "I didn't make a scene. I stood still." That's all it took. That's how fragile this lie is. You call it peace, but it's just silence. Silence you stitched up with appearances and small talk and perfect little narratives. But I'm still here. And I wore the truth tonight. My mother said nothing. She stared past me for a beat, as if looking at a version of me she preferred. The younger one, the quieter one. The one who hadn't spoken up about what Dad did. The one who hadn't been erased. "I know it was easier without me," I said. "Easier to pretend. But I'm not the villain here, Mum. I wasn't the one stealing from the offering plate." Her jaw tightened. "You still shouldn't have gone to the police." I felt something old stir in me, something that once wanted her approval so badly it hurt. "So you still believe covering up was better?" "I believe family protects each other." "No," I said. "Family faces the truth together. But you chose denial. You chose saving face. The silence between us stretched tight as wire. You're not the only one who suffered, Eleanor, I know that. But I'm the only one who got cast out for telling the truth." She looked away, her arms falling to her sides. Her voice cracked, then the first break in her perfect posture. "You think I didn't cry for you. You think it was easy to let you go. I don't know what you did," I admitted, "because you never told me. I had to hold it together for Madeline, for the community, for myself. And you did," I said. "You held it together by cutting me out." That's not strength, Mum. That's fear. She took one step toward me. Why did you come tonight? Because I needed to see if any of this was real, I said. If there was still something left worth salvaging. If you'd see me, not the scandal, not the embarrassment, not the uniform, just me. The silence came again, but this time it didn't feel like retreat. It felt like both of us standing in the ashes of a fire we'd never really put out. Just buried. I don't know what to say to you, she said finally. You don't have to say anything, I replied. You just have to stop pretending I don't exist. She didn't respond, and that, in a way, was its own kind of truth. I left the room first. I didn't slam the door, I didn't look back. As I stepped back into the dim hallway, the murmurs of the reception returned, muffled now like voices underwater. I stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me like a new kind of armour. Not polished, not ceremonial, just worn in the right places. I walked back toward the party, not to rejoin it, but to finish this night on my own terms. As I crossed the threshold back into the warmth and chatter, a memory erupted. I was 29, just months after that Kandahar mission wrapped successfully. I'd been nominated internally quietly for a major promotion, one that would have made me at the time the youngest general in the most strategic commands. It wasn't public, it was a whisper in the right rooms, a nod from the brass, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, that mix of pride and fear. Ethan was among the first to offer congratulations. He didn't know I was his fiancé's sister, one of the ironies of that moment. He told Madeline about me as a brave commander who saved his life, and when he did, I saw the way Madeline looked at him. That mix of admiration and hesitation. I never asked why she never said it, and neither did I. But in the weeks after the nomination review stalled, my staff told me there were questions, discrepancies in reports, overinflated numbers, favouritism. The panel paused, and it never restarted. I didn't know then who had triggered the freeze, just that the path ahead had dissolved. My dreams shifted just as suddenly as they had formed. Tonight, watching my mother's silent face, it came back. And the realization hit. What if Madeline had done more than stand by? It had been weeks before the panel was scheduled. Madeline had a friend, a former soldier from my unit, someone I barely knew who had worked in a logistics office. The rumour spread that a packet of documents labelled internal, flagged urgent, had found its way through channels. Not from the top brass, but from someone lower down, someone with just enough access. Someone trusted. It arrived in an envelope typed anonymous. It claimed I padded success rates, exaggerated casualty numbers, misused funds. It included internal comm codes and highlighted passages it looked official. The review paused because the brass couldn't ignore it. I replay each moment, Madeline knowing that Ethan would speak to her. Laura's hesitation before handing over the envelope. The way the nomination got shelved overnight, and me at 30 waking up to realise everything I'd worked for had been derailed. But I had no proof. I moved on. No inquiries, no accusations, just silence. Decades later in that hospital room, I found my promotion had never gone through. My record was marked under review indefinitely. I'd assumed it was just bureaucratic inertia, that maybe I'd screwed up somewhere. I carried that gap with me, the unspoken what if of a broken opportunity. And tonight, standing again where family once rejected me, I saw the pattern my name still erased. My presence treated as a glitch. Everything smoothed over because it was easier to pretend I didn't exist. Even as I sat at a party where they whispered when I entered and avoided my eyes. Their embarrassment covered my shame. Their silence fed my loss. And now I understood someone close had pushed that loss into my path. I paused by the punch table watching servers pass trays of shrimp cocktails. Everything looked normal, except for the swift swallow I took of old memory. They never knew what they'd done. They thought it was a warning in time. They thought I'd fall. They thought I'd fade, but I didn't. Tonight, though, I was ready for the reckoning. I stepped forward and caught Madeline's eye on the fringes of the reception room. She had slipped away from the guests, likely tipped off by our mother's hushed warnings, and now hovered near the doorway, as though the decades of silence had built a physical barrier she feared to cross. I held my invitation in one hand, my filed copy of the letter in the other, and I knew the moment had come. "Madeline," I said quietly, loud enough for her to hear. She turned, her posture stiffened, shoulders back, chin up, like she was guarding something fragile inside. "I have something for you," I continued. My voice didn't shake. I unfolded the plain white printout and laid it in her hand. Her eyes snapped to the paper, then up to my face. The room seemed to close in the clink of forks, and murmurs of congratulations faded. All that remained was the air between us. I held her gaze. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. She didn't meet my eyes. Her lips parted, then closed. Silence. I cleared my throat. "It's a letter," I explained, "sent from someone inside my chain of command a few years ago. Anonymous. Accused me of padding reports, manipulating data, exploiting my position. It was enough to derail my promotion." I watched her swallow, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edges of the paper. "Your handwriting," I said firmly, "and that spelling of resilience, the extra E in the middle, only appears once in this document. And only on one other paper I've seen. Yours." My heart wasn't racing. I was calm, like I'd rehearsed this confrontation 1,000 times. Her face collapsed. "Eleanor," she whispered but her words faltered under the weight of my stare. "Why, Madeline?" I pressed. "Why sabotage me?" Tears filled her eyes. She blinked them away. "Because," she began, voice low, "I know you reported Dad. I know you made him fall. You destroyed our family. And then you were celebrated. And suddenly, you were going places while I stayed behind with nothing. I watched you become unstoppable." Her voice cracked. "I didn't want you to go higher without me knowing how." I listened. It would have been easier if she'd blamed someone else, or if she'd lied, but she didn't. I nodded. "You didn't stab me. You slipped a stone in my pocket and let me trip." My voice was soft now, but the words were precise. "You watched me succeed, and you felt erased. You acted out of fear and jealousy." I paused. "I forgive you for that." Her shoulders shook. A few guests nearby stiffened, sensing the confrontation. I raised my voice slightly to reach beyond us, to make sure no one missed the truth. "But I won't let this define either of us. You stopped me once, but I'm still here." She exhaled, hands trembling. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice raw. I thought if you didn't get that promotion, everyone would agree you didn't matter. I was selfish. I used someone's help. I was wrong." I folded the letter and handed it back gently. "You hurt me, but tonight I choose to own my story, with or without your apology." I turned, signaling the end. "Now I need to return." She watched me go, tears streaming, unable to move. In that moment, our silence spoke volumes, pain, regret, recognition that everything had changed. I found my mother in the hallway, standing stiff and barely blinking. I looked at her and felt nothing but clarity. I had told my truth. She didn't protest. She didn't deny. That was enough. As I moved away, part of me felt released. Our family's broken ties might never fully mend, but we had unmasked the lie that I didn't exist. Back at the Pentagon, the halls didn't echo with cheers or applause, but there was something deeper than recognition weaving through the day. I walked into the office of the Joint Chiefs with an envelope in my hand, one I'd carried for days now, not for approval, but because it held purpose. Inside was my proposal, the Resilience Protocol, a program designed to support service members who had faced family rejection spouses, left parents disowned them, siblings turned away. These were men and women whose homecoming was met with more silence than celebration. It was time they had a counterweight, a community that said, "You matter. We see you." General Davis raised his eyebrows as he scanned the proposal. He'd worked with me long enough to know this wasn't about politics. This was personal. "Why?" now he asked quietly. I looked him straight in the eyes. "Because I've seen what happens when the people you should count on are the ones who erase you. I want to make sure no one serves, wondering if they're still human, still loved, still worth something." He nodded slowly, folding the letter into his palm. "I'll take it to the board." The process was procedural, slow, expected. Presentations, meetings, revisions. I didn't seek press coverage. I didn't want headlines. I only wanted the program to exist quietly, meaningfully. The Resilience Protocol would offer counselling, housing support, peer mentorship. It would partner with veterans nonprofits and provide small grants. Nothing flashy, just a foundation. 2 weeks later, I received a short memo approved. Effective immediately. There were no fanfares, no press release. The announcement went out in internal memos and via service channels. But the impact was immediate. Within days, calls came in from soldiers stationed overseas, from those in recovery, even from civilians connected through military spouses. Each message started the same: I didn't know who else to turn to. That was enough for me. I refused every request for interviews. I didn't want to be a story. I didn't need that kind of validation. My work would speak for itself. If someone in a distant base found a lifeline, that was recognition enough. Late one evening, I walked past the project office. I paused at the door listening. Inside, a small team was reviewing case files. Names, notes, plans. Not for publicity, but to build networks. I watched them organising, strategizing, fighting each small battle in quiet cubicles. Proud of them, I walked out and let the door shut behind me. In the coming months, the Resilience Protocol gained traction. Metrics showed dozens of service members supported, several crises averted. Word spread across branches from Army to Air Force to Marines. Other commands asked to replicate the model. I stayed in the background, briefed senior leaders, passed memos. Never once did I step into the spotlight. One afternoon, Dan found me in my office. He held a printed email, anonymous, heartfelt, from a lieutenant who said her family had disowned her over her deployment choice. She'd found a lifeline through the program and was rebuilding. She wrote, "I didn't realize being forgotten hurt so much until someone showed me I wasn't." Dan smiled. "You did this." I looked at the words on the screen. A quiet honor more powerful than any medal. "We did this," I corrected him. He nodded. Then he asked, "You okay? With it being your legacy?" I paused. Not fame, not estrangement, but legacy. I felt the weight of the question. I'd rather have names than headlines. I'll take lives changed over applause any day. He let that settle, then stepped back. His parting line. "Then you made the right choice." That night, I replayed the memory of the wedding hall. The stunned silence, the subtle ache of recognition in the eyes around me. I thought of my mother, of Madeline, of all the things left unsaid. But here, in the quiet corridors of change, this was different. I wasn't writing my own story, but enabling others to rediscover theirs. In the days that followed, invitations for speaking engagements trickled in. Organizations wanted to highlight this new protocol, its impact. I declined each one. I wrote back a short note. "Thank you, but I'm not the story. The people we serve are." At the office door, I pinned the email from that lieutenant. I added more each week, brief testimonials, names redacted, gratitude expressed, a wall of voices, a silent chorus saying, "We exist, we matter." Standing before it one morning, I let my hand quiver as I pinned another note. I thought of the invitation I once received, the one meant to erase me. This wall, these lives, they reversed that erasure. Not in public applause, not in my family's seeing, but in something more enduring. Work carried on. Reports were compiled. Meetings held. Lives saved with the quiet effort of many behind-the-scenes networkers and counsellors. I walked through it all with no fanfare, no stage lights, just steady purpose in every memo and every case reviewed. And in that steady purpose, I found what I never had at home: acknowledgement, not based on blood or permission, but on shared humanity and resilience. That was the legacy I chose. I now live by the ocean in a small coastal town far from the Pentagon. My mornings begin with the smell of salt and the sound of gulls. I run part of the day, walk my dog along the dunes, then return to my home office overlooking the water. Here I direct the Resilience Network, our non-profit offshoot of the protocol. We serve military personnel whose homecomings brought silence instead of celebration. We offer workshops, peer counselling, resource connections. We build communities where there were none. My work is quiet but growing. Last month we sponsored a retreat for spouses of deployed soldiers who came back to empty rooms. We partnered with a veterans housing project that had asked for our help. Each week I read email updates from people who say their lives shifted because they finally found someone who understood that being erased doesn't mean you cease to exist. I never reached out to my mother or Madeline again. It's not bitterness, it's clarity. I carry no hate. Why should I? They made their choices years ago. I made mine. Life is too short to carry resentment when there are lives to lift, voices to restore. A few months ago, Dan stopped by my house unannounced. He saw my bare walls, no photos of family events, no framed degrees or medals, just a shelf with a few books and my running shoes by the door. He looked around, then said, "This place suits you." I told him I don't need reminders of who didn't choose me. I need reminders of who did. He nodded, then pointed to the stack of letters on my desk. You know they call you a hero, quietly, humbly, even strangers. It's changed things people talk about, what returned home really means. I let that sink in. A quiet acknowledgement, yes. A life rebuilt not on approval or forgiveness, but on self-trust and purpose. That evening, I walked down to the beach. The sun was low. The tide came in soft and steady. I thought of the house I left, the invitations I accepted, the people I chose. I thought of forgiveness and realized I didn't need it to be whole. I practiced the lines I might say, if I returned to that world again, I didn't come to be forgiven. I came to be seen. But I didn't send those lines to anyone. I didn't need to. The sea hears them anyway. Back in my house, I sat at my desk. I reached for my laptop and typed one last note into the annual report I did not return to reclaim what was lost. I returned to affirm what was never erased. I added one more sentence under my name: Eleanor Grayson, founder and executive director, the Resilience Network. I looked out at the darkening horizon. No applause, no audience, just the steady pulse of waves, resilient, unwavering. And that was enough. If you're someone who's ever been pushed aside, misunderstood, or made to feel like your story didn't matter, please know this. Your presence still carries weight. You don't need permission to exist. And you don't have to walk alone. If this story found you at the right time, maybe it was meant to. And if you'd like to hear more stories of quiet strength and quiet survival, feel free to stay. Subscribe. You're welcome here.